All right, everyone. Hello, and welcome to week 8. We're now around the midpoint of the semester. We are week 8, and we are the midpoint of our third unit. The third unit, again, is semi-formal and suggestive persuasion. Last week, we looked at advertising. This week, we're looking at news/media, and then next week, we're looking at narrative. So, again, we're moving into more broad, ephemeral kind of territory here. Last week, looking at advertisements, we're looking at a pretty specific kind of phenomenon, the messaging that surrounds the attempts to try to sell a product, right? And we can think of that pretty broadly, but we're still dealing with a pretty specific kind of thing. This week, we're thinking about media or news/media. And so we're trying to think about the kind of messaging and information that we encounter in a pretty routine way on a day-to-day basis, right? So, you're pulling up your web browser or your phone, you're looking at your screen, or maybe you're on TV and you're just kind of scrolling through the channels, the kind of stuff that's coming at you in a very normal, kind of casual way. You got CNN, you got Fox News, MSNBC, you stop, you watch, you get some information, you get some stories, you get some mediation coming at you, right? Maybe you don't feel like watching the news, so you go to another channel and there's an episode of Friends, or there's an episode of Will and Grace, or who knows, there's some show on and it's dealing with some social issue, whether it's like, I don't know, recycling or, leaving kids at home alone, or I don't know, whatever. There's some issue in there and the message is coming at you and it's kind of shaping your perceptions in certain ways. That's kind of what we're after here. We're in that realm of pretty diffuse, pretty ephemeral kind of messaging, but there's still a media kind of shaping framework that's going on here. And the reading that we're looking at this week, it's just one again. You guys are getting off easy with the readings of late. Next week we go up to 2 again. But it's just a kind of not terribly huge reading and also not a terribly deep reading, but it covers a fair bit of ground, so it's still pretty useful. And what's going on with this reading by Holbert and Tchernev, Media Influence as Persuasion, and again, corresponding notes. Not too many of them this week. What we're doing here is we've got a kind of media scholarly approach going on with these folks here. So these are like media scholars. And they're in the world of media, you don't necessarily always talk about persuasion. You talk about media effects. You probably heard that phrase before, media effects, right? So we think about, advertising and its media effects. We think about video games and its media effects, or we think about, violence as depicted in the news and the media effects of that, right? So the effects part presumes that something is happening between the messages that are being sent out and the messages as they're being received. When we say effects, we're saying that the message has landed in some way, that it's produced some kind of a result or outcome, or there's been an impact, right? Media messages sent out, right, all flying around. And then the effects part is now things have happened. Things have changed. People are buying things more. They're buying them less, or they're behaving this way more. They're behaving this way less. They're going to more games. They're going to less games. More of this product, less of that product. That's all media effects. The persuasion question kind of kicks in between those two things, right? You've got the media messaging kind of sending it out, and then you've got the effect stuff all kind of happening. Well, what's going on in between here? Normally we think of that as persuasion. Media effects scholars aren't necessarily always also already rhetoric and persuasion scholars. And so the question of persuasion doesn't often bubble up in the media effects discussions, just like media effects questions don't bubble up when we're talking about persuasion. There's overlaps, but they're not always the same, right? Nevertheless, this chapter wants to think about those points of contact, where if we're thinking about media, and we're thinking about mass media, and we're thinking about mass media effects, why don't we think about those effects through the literature and through the presumptions and through the modeling and dynamics of persuasion? That's an interesting kind of an approach here. And the authors are basically saying, like, here are ways in which we can think about media effects through the literature, the scholarship, some of the insights of persuasion. But they don't go deep into like examining those connections, right? It's more about just sort of saying like, here's the kind of stuff that we should probably be looking at if we were interested in media and persuasion. And so there's a little bit that's unsatisfying, but there's some good suggestions and good stuff pointed out along the way here. And so we'll just kind of point out what's being pointed out. Talk a little bit about some of those assumptions and how things are kind of thrown together here, and that's kind of it. And there's a lot left for us to kind of consider on our own and be thinking about on our own. So I've already kind of mentioned the first point. The chapter's an attempt to find these points of contact between media effects literature and persuasion literature. And so the first way that the authors are going to go about this is by noting. And who they get this from? This is Miller. This is second page 37 on the left. Miller stresses that persuasion encompasses three different processes. We got response shaping, we've got response reinforcement, and we've got response change. I think of these as different phases, or potentially three different kinds of audience members given where they're at in reference to the change behavior, right? So if you're trying to get someone to stop drinking Starbucks coffee and start drinking Bad Owl coffee, this is the way you want to break it down, is you want to kind of break it down into these three, I think of them as phases or segments. First, you got to introduce the idea of the change. Then once they're kind of comfortable with it, you kind of reinforce that idea. And then once the idea has been reinforced, now you're trying to actually like tip them into the actually making the change part. So what it's doing here is it's suggesting that anytime we change our behavior, there's kind of a three-part process. There's the like being introduced to the possibility, there's the strengthening of our attitude toward that new change behavior, and then there's the change itself, right? So what do we got there? Formation, reinforcement, and change. I think of those as different phases. And so if you're an advertiser saying you're trying to get people to buy your product, or if it's a campaign, you're trying to get people to stop doing something, you can think about anyone out there as inhabiting one of these three different kinds of phases of the process, right? We're trying to get as many people, as many points of the process as possible to move them forward, but we might only be at the thinking about it phase. Or maybe we're at the like ready to change, just need a little bit more of a nudge part of the phase, right? So three different phases to persuasion, to being persuaded or having been persuaded. And then they also introduce these factors. Same page, next column over, we got 5 factors. In addition, any discussion of mass communication influence must take into account the full range of factors that are at work in the production of a media effect. McGuire argues that 5 factors play a role in the production of a media effect. The message itself, the source of the message, the recipient to whom the message is being sent, the channel through which it is being conveyed, and the context in which all of this is happening. Each one of those 5 factors or elements or components are discrete and significant in their own right, and they're a variable in the sense that persuasion or the media effects can go all over the place depending on how these variables are playing out, right? So now, take those 5 factors, think about the 3 different phases of persuasion, and you can think about the 5 factors at each of the different phases of persuasion for a total typology of these 15 different considerations. And now this is on page 38 here, the table. So what the authors are doing is they're saying, if we want to be thinking about media as persuasion, let's think about it in these 3 phases, and let's think about the 5 factors at each of these 5 or each of these 3 phases. So that's 15 different kind of variables. Thinking about formation, reinforcement, and then change behavior. And then so on 38, what they're doing here is they're sort of saying, all right, so now the field of media scholarship has actually thought about each of these moments, each of these phases, and the 5 variables at each phase. And there's research that we can point to to learn a little bit more. But again, all they're doing is kind of briefly, so for the next 3 or 4 pages here, they're going through each of the little boxes in this grid here to talk about, right? So the first one is, we've got the first category is persuasion formation or attitude formation. So now you can think about the source, thinking about the source, right? So if a message is coming from the New York Times versus Fox News, that's the kind of source question. If you are someone who loves Fox News and you know that a report is coming out from the New York Times, you might be inclined to disagree with that report just because you know that it comes from the New York Times, right? Conversely, if you're someone who's a hardcore New York Times reader and you know that a report's coming from Fox News, you might dismiss it out of hand because you know the source, right? And you might not like that source. That's all we're kind of saying here in terms of the persuasive aspect of the source, in terms of how you might originally receive or form that opinion, right? Now, in terms of that reinforcement category, similar kind of thing, right? So if you're a New York Times reader and you already have an attitude about recycling, let's say, and you now see a report that's coming from, let's say, a friendly news site like the Washington Post, chances are that's going to reinforce what you already believe because it's a similar kind of source, right? So that's just source, and that's formation, and then reinforcement. Now, in terms of change, again, if you're a New York Times reader and something's coming from MSNBC, maybe the New Yorker, the Atlantic, that's just going to reinforce even more, and that might even push you more in the direction of, you know what, I've got to completely stop buying altogether, right? It can go in different ways depending on the sources. Now, that's just source. The message itself matters. The channel, right, how it's coming at you, the medium itself, that's more McLuhan that we'll see in a moment. And then, of course, the recipient, who are you? What are your kind of characteristics? What's your age? Where are you from? What's your socioeconomic status? What's your religion? What's your ethnic identity? What's your sexual identity? And so on and on and on. All of these things matter in terms of, again, attitude formation, attitude reinforcement, and then, of course, change as well. So that's interesting. Again, we don't get the deep dive into looking at all the particulars of each of these boxes, but you can see how they all matter in terms of their persuasive possibilities, okay? So the next few pages are kind of working through the very briefly the research or some research on each of these different points of the overall kind of persuasive process of media messages. I won't dwell on all 15. I think they make sense there, and if you have questions about anything particular, obviously we can chat about them. But then starting on page 43, we get now we're kind of stepping back and we're thinking about, all right, now what are some kind of media theories or sociology type theories of media persuasion or of media effects and media influence that can also go a good distance in terms of explaining the persuasive properties of these theories or of these messages. And then we've got these 5 kind of theories. We get agenda setting, we get cultivation, we get social learning, we get just McLuhan, and then we get diffusion of innovations. And I think these are all quite interesting and good. And again, the authors are not doing a deep dive to explain how each of these theories is persuasive in a kind of total sense. They're just, again, kind of indicating that, yes, agenda setting is a kind of media theory that also deals with persuasion. And so they give us some interesting little suggestions for how that is so. And so some of the language in here, which I've thrown into our notes, is relevant, like this business of salience transfer and priming. This is an established theory within the kind of a media effects literature, this business of agenda setting, right? Just trying to think of a good example here. Like, we often hear, like, should we have covered it so much? Like when the media is talking to itself, when reporters are interviewing reporters, like, should we have covered that so much? Should we have covered Donald Trump's, Russiagate story so much? Or does at a certain point, does that work against you? But you're pooling your resources at a story because, you're trying to drive traffic for specific reasons. Media sets agenda by how it pools its resources, by how it how many reporters it sends on a story, or how much ink it spends on a given report, right? How much time, how much energy, how many people are being sent out to report on that versus that over there, right? And so the media can set an agenda by making things urgent and salient and the thing that we think we need to be talking about. I'm always amused when I go on to Twitter by, because Twitter tells you this is what's trending right now. And it often feels like it's trending just because Twitter wants it to trend, right? It's like 17 people are tweeting about Kanye, what stupid thing Kanye's just said. That really, we have to drop everything so we know what Kanye said about whatever, right? And there does seem to be this kind of weird, like, I don't know, like, where's it coming from kind of thing. But in any case, the business is like a trend is basically saying, like, pay attention to this. This is the agenda. This is the order of priority. So you go to your social media platform, it's telling you this is what's trending. Oh, that's the agenda right there. Whatever is at the top, trending number one, that's the number one story. We can see all kinds of problems with trending and as agenda setting, but nevertheless, it's about traffic. It's about where, again, resources are being pooled, where energy is being focused, where time and effort are being concentrated. That's agenda setting. Cultivation. This is an interesting one. So I'm on a master's graduate student major kind of project right now, and it's about media representations of Asian American women. And we have these representations over here, and then we have violence over here, and it's always hard to say that this show or this caricature of a character is what's responsible for this violence over here or this mistreatment over here. And so you need to have some kind of a theory that explains how what's going on the screen over here in terms of misrepresentation or underrepresentation or bad representation is responsible for what's going on over here. And cultivation feels like a pretty good way of getting at that set of associations, because you can say, even without saying direct correspondence or direct causality between this program and that behavior, you can say, well, but people are cultivated in these narratives, in these worlds. We grow up around media. We grow up with stories coming at us, with depictions coming at us, with images and representations. And it's all around us all the time, whether it's fictional in stories and shows and movies, or even if it's nonfiction, if it's the way that we talk about each other in the news, or the way that we, certain language that we use. And it's this cultivation mindset that, like, just being around these screens, right? We are brought up in these worlds. So page 44 on the right there, viewers are born into a symbolic world and cannot avoid exposure to its recurrent patterns. So this idea of recurrent patterns, of exposure and access to different kinds of images, repetitive images, repetitive language, words, terms, and so on. And these things can kind of get inside of us and create behavior down the line, right? And this business of mainstreaming, I think, is quite interesting. It's similar to agenda setting. It's basically normalizing or mainstreaming something is like, again, repeated coverage of a phenomenon, repeated language, recurrent, recycled attitudes, values, language, imagery, and so on, mainstreams a certain phenomenon or normalizes it. And that has that kind of agenda function. Again, you can see the persuasion all kind of woven throughout here in terms of changing behaviors, changing attitudes, changing actions eventually. So that's all good stuff. Social learning. We got a 4-stage process here, which is kind of similar to the persuasion process at the beginning of formation, reinforcement, and change. Here we've got paying attention. I'm on page 45 on the left bottom there. First, an individual pays attention to another person. Second stage is defined as a retention process. So it's attending, and then it's retaining And third, there's a next column, there's a production process. Production process involves guided enactment, the monitoring of social feedback of those enactments, and the manufacturing of creative adjustments. So we're going from sort of observing to enacting here. And so I think cultivation and social learning are kind of similar. Social learning is just kind of breaking it down into these phases. Now, McLuhan, we're going to get back to McLuhan in a couple of weeks. Week 13 is actually called Medium as Message. So another month or so, we're going to be reading some McLuhan. So we'll get into this more deeply, but the basic gist of the McLuhan kind of approach is to think about media as technology, and as a specific kind of technology that we live with and develop certain kinds of responses to based on the specifics of the technology itself, right? So we live differently with televisions than we do with smartphones. One thing that I've noticed in terms of change behavior with smartphones is that we sit in our cars and parking lots a lot more than we used to. This didn't used to be a thing, but like now you can go into a parking lot and you can walk through that parking lot and you can look around and you can see heads, people just like in their cars. Because you can literally be in your car and you can be like answering emails, you can be doing research, you can be, I don't know, applying for a passport. You can do so many different things on your phone that now people just go to parking lots and they don't leave their cars. And so that's changed kind of the social landscape, specifically because of these things, because they're handheld, because they're so powerful, they're so easy to use. And so, you know, the McLuhan thing is about thinking about media as part of an environment. And mediums are specific technologies that change environments just in terms of how we adopt them, how we use them, how we engage them, versus other kinds of mediums, right? And so you think about all these different kinds of media technologies that we have around us, we use them and we engage them in different kinds of ways, right? And we could get into affordance theory to talk about that a little bit deeper, but we're not going to, at least right now. But the thing about McLuhan is he's interested in media as a kind of an environment or a landscape, because specific mediums, shape and influence behaviors in specific ways that are not true of other kinds of mediums and media technologies. And so we want to be looking at the kind of the total social environment to see how different kinds of mediums, you know, the newspaper. Think about how people used to interact with the newspaper. You know, sit down, cross your legs, get your coffee, sit down on a bus, quietly fold the thing over and watch it, you know, or watch it, read it. Right? We live differently with newspapers than we do with televisions or that we do with iPads or whatever. And they change things. And so the McLuhan approach is to be thinking about specific patterns that develop in relation to new technologies that change kind of how we live together. And we'll think about that as persuasive. And the last one is the diffusion of innovations. This is, again, more of a kind of sociological theory of technology that you can also bring into a discussion of media and persuasion. And it's basically this idea of like how we roll out new things, new commodities, new artifacts, new innovations. Now, the innovation, you can think about this in relationship to the communication campaign discussion that we had. Rolling out a campaign, right? This is a new idea or it's a new product or whatever. There's a lot of that in here, but we're thinking about an innovation as potentially an idea or a product or a story or, you know, whatever. And this theory will help us understand that rollout. And so looking at the bottom of 47, bottom left, Rogers and colleagues identified a few characteristics that influence the speed and degree to which any one innovation becomes diffuse. Just trying to think of innovations that have spread. I remember a few years back, it was the fidget spinners. Remember fidget spinners? My goodness, these things just like exploded in the course of, it seemed like a couple of weeks. My kid was obsessed with fidget spinners. Dad, it'll help me with my anxiety. Please, 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 please. Everyone had to get a fidget spinner. I don't hear much about fidget spinners anymore. So the diffusion just went like crazy for a while there, and then it just kind of like faded off. But what kind of characteristics are we interested in here? So the relative advantage, is it a better whatever? Does it give more advantage? Is the innovation comparable with existing lifestyles? How simple is the innovation? So these are the kinds of things that people are kind of considering, whether or not they're even thinking about it, when they're considering whether to adopt a new innovation, right? Does it have advantages? Is it compatible with my existing lifestyle, right? Is it simple? Is there a risk? Is there a trial period? Does it have clean, observable results? Again, I'm thinking about the kind of